Imagine fighting this brutal, decades-long war for your nation's independence. I mean, you sacrifice your youth, your livelihood, countless lives are lost. And then you finally win.
Right, the occupying colonial power actually surrenders.
Exactly. But before you are handed the keys to your brand new country, the Allied army that, helped you win, they hand you a pen.
Which is never a good sign.
No, not at all. They tell you that to get your actual independence, you have to write a very specific rule into your brand new constitution.
Yeah.
And this is the kicker. That rule gives their foreign military the absolute legal right to invade your country whenever they see fit.
It just completely shatters the illusion of what a victory is supposed to look like.
Oh, totally.
We always tend to view national independence as this clean break, right? Like a ribbon-cutting ceremony. But in the realm of geopolitics, the transition of power is just rarely that neat. Often, the chains of colonialism are just swapped out for the invisible bindings of international law.
Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to another deep dive. Today, we are opening up a massive stack of historical sources to examine a single, wild piece of United States legislation from 1901.
The Platt Amendment.
Right, the Platt Amendment.
Yeah.
Our mission here is to really understand a central, almost unbelievable core tension for you, the listener. Like, how does a country gain its independence only to legally sign away its sovereignty in its own foundational documents?
And to unpack that tension, we are going to rely on a very specific analytical framework today.
Yeah, how are we breaking this down?
Well, we will meticulously break down the actual mechanisms of this amendment. It took the form of 8 really stringent conditions placed upon Cuba.
8 specific rules.
Exactly. Then we'll trace the long-term, honestly devastating impacts those conditions had on the island's land, its vital sugar industry, and the social fabric of the people living there.
Right, because this isn't just some abstract treaty gathering dust in an archive somewhere.
Not at all. We are looking at how economic leverage and legal architecture can entirely substitute for outright imperial annexation.
It is the literal blueprint for how an industrializing superpower managed to turn a neighboring island into a self-governing colony.
Yeah, that's a perfect way to phrase it.
But, before we dig into the specific rules the U.S. imposed on Cuba, we really need to set the geopolitical stage here. Like, what made the United States feel they even had the authority to dictate these terms to a newly forming nation?
Right. Well, we have to go back to the aftermath of the Spanish-American War. This is right around the turn of the century, heading into 1899.
Okay, so the war's fresh.
Very fresh. Spain, the old colonial power, has been defeated and forced out of Cuba. But the end of that conflict did not result in an empty island ready for immediate Cuban self-rule.
Because the U.S. military was still there, right?
Exactly. The United States maintained a massive military arsenal and literally tens of thousands of troops on the ground.
Wow.
Yeah. Their stated objective was to protect U.S. holdings, meaning investments that American businesses had already made on the island, and to sort of mediate the complex transition away from Spanish rule.
So they basically set up shop.
They did. The U.S. established a formal military government of Cuba.
Man, so you have a revolutionary Cuban government forming. I mean, these are people who have literally spent their entire lives fighting for this exact moment.
Right, true revolutionaries.
And they're looking across the table at an American military occupation.
And that occupation was deeply, deeply influenced by a piece of legislation passed just before the war began. It's known as the Teller Amendment.
The Teller Amendment. Okay, how does that fit in?
Well, the Teller Amendment was crucial because it explicitly prohibited the United States from annexing Cuba outright.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it legally bound the U.S. government to leave control of the island to its people once pacification was achieved.
Okay, on the surface, that sounds like a massive win for the anti-imperialist movement.
It really does.
Because at the time, there were these incredibly vocal expansionist politicians in Washington who wanted to just, plant the flag, make Cuba a territory, and eventually a state.
Oh, absolutely. The expansionist lobby was huge.
And the Teller Amendment seemingly blocked that. It reads like a very noble hands-off approach, like, we'll help you win, and then we'll leave.
You'd think so, right? But the sources reveal a much more complicated set of motivations here.
Naturally.
Senator Henry M. Teller of Colorado, who was the author of the amendment, is just a fascinating study in political contradictions.
How so?
Well, while he did later become a fierce critic of American imperialism in places like the Philippines, his initial motivations regarding Cuba are heavily debated by historians in our sources.
Okay, what's the debate?
There's a very strong historical argument that suggests the Teller Amendment wasn't born purely out of respect for Cuban sovereignty.
Right.
Rather, it was born out of domestic economic self-interest.
Wait, domestic economics? You mean like protecting American industries from having to compete with Cuban imports?
You hit the nail on the head, specifically the American sugar beet industry.
Sugar beets, really?
Yes. Senator Teller represented a state with significant agricultural interests. If Cuba were annexed and became an official U.S. territory, its massive, highly efficient sugarcane industry would suddenly have barrier-free access to the American market.
Oh, wow, because there wouldn't be any tariff if it was a U.S. territory.
Exactly. And that flood of cheap Cuban sugar would have completely decimated domestic sugar beet growers in the U.S.
That is wild.
So preventing annexation was actually a very effective way to keep a tariff wall up against a major agricultural competitor.
That completely reframes the entire narrative for me.
Yeah.
It wasn't necessarily just about human rights or the grand principle of self-determination.
For some, maybe, but definitely not for everyone.
Right, for a significant political bloc, it was just about making sure Cuban sugar didn't bankrupt farmers in the American Midwest and West.
It perfectly illustrates how foreign policy is so often just domestic policy wearing a different hat, you know?
Totally. So, regardless of the underlying motives, the Teller Amendment created this legal bind. The U.S. legally could not annex Cuba.
Right, their hands were technically tied.
But as the military occupation stretched into 1900 and 1901, the McKinley administration and its officials had to be getting anxious.
Oh, they grew doubly anxious. They looked at the Cuban Constituent Assembly, which was busy drafting a new constitution, and American officials possessed this profound, just incredibly paternalistic mistrust of them.
They didn't think they could handle it.
Exactly. The sources show they fundamentally viewed the Cuban politicians as unfit for self-governance.
Right, so they felt they needed to manage them. They wanted the benefits of controlling the island's strategic location and its economy without the political burden of actually adding a new star to the flag.
That is the exact paradox they were trapped in.
So, who steps up to solve this geopolitical puzzle?
A very powerful trio of American figures took the lead here.
Okay, who are the players?
You have Senator Orville H. Platt, who chaired the Senate Committee on Relations with Cuba. Then there's General Leonard Wood, who was actively acting as the U.S. military governor of Cuba at the time.
Okay, so the guy in charge on the ground.
Exactly. And finally, Elihu Root, who was the U.S. Secretary of War.
A heavy-hitting group.
Very. And they needed a formula to maintain public order and protect American interests while still technically adhering to that non-annexation promise of the Teller Amendment.
They needed to create a self-governing colony.
Precisely.
And the way they pushed this formula through Congress is honestly one of the most revealing details in all the sources we looked at.
It really tells you everything about their priorities.
Yeah, because they didn't introduce this as a grand standalone treaty to be debated for months on the Senate floor.
No, because time was their absolute enemy here.
Why were they in such a rush?
The 56th United States Congress was scheduled to end its session on March 4th, 1901.
Oh, so the clock was ticking.
Exactly. A standalone bill would have required lengthy committee hearings, public debate, and a really slow voting process.
And they didn't have time for that.
Right. So instead of a separate diplomatic bill, they took this geopolitical blueprint, this document that would literally dictate the future of a foreign nation, and they attached it as a legislative rider to the Army Appropriations Act of 1901.
Wait. An Appropriations Act, isn't that literally just a routine budget bill?
Yes. It is the annual legislation that literally funds the military.
That is incredibly sneaky.
It authorizes the money to pay the soldiers, buy the equipment, and keep the Army functioning for the next fiscal year.
So by attaching the Platt Amendment to this critical funding bill,
they virtually guaranteed its passage.
Yeah.
Because voting against the Platt Amendment meant voting to defund the entire U.S. Army.
wow. Think about what that means for the Cuban people, you know?
It's devastating.
The foundational document of their independence wasn't debated in Havana. It wasn't carefully negotiated over months between equal sovereign states.
Not at all.
It was slipped into the margins of a foreign military's payroll document because Washington politicians were rushing to go home for the legislative recess.
It perfectly underscores the unilateral nature of this whole mandate. The United States was dictating terms to a captive audience.
I mean, I was trying to think of an analogy for this. It's like a roommate who publicly promises they won't take over your house. That's the Teller Amendment. But then they hand you this inescapable lease agreement detailing exactly who you can invite over and how you spend your money.
Yes. You own the house in name only.
Right. And to truly understand how tight that lease agreement was, we really need to dive into the specific mechanisms.
Let's break down the actual text because the architecture of this document is just brilliant in its restrictiveness.
Okay, let's get into it.
The Platt Amendment consists of 8 specific conditions. It actually opens with a preamble stating the U.S. will leave the government and control of the island to its people.
Ah, generous.
Right. But only as soon as a government is established under a constitution that defines future relations with the U.S. based on the following rules.
It's a conditional withdrawal. We will end the military occupation, but only if you agree to this exact list of demands.
Exactly.
Okay, so what is Condition I?
So Condition I isolates Cuba diplomatically. It states that the government of Cuba shall never enter into any treaty or compact with any foreign power that will impair its independence.
Okay, that sounds okay at first glance.
Well, crucially, it also dictates that Cuba cannot authorize any foreign power to obtain colonization or military or naval lodgment over any portion of the island.
So they are building a diplomatic wall around the island.
Exactly.
Because if you are a newly independent nation, your very first instinct is to build global alliances, sign trade pacts, and establish embassies.
You want to participate on the world stage.
Right. But Condition I tells Cuba they cannot make treaties that the U.S. decides might, quote-unquote, impair their independence.
And practically speaking, that meant Cuba couldn't align with Britain, Germany, France, or any other global power that might challenge American hegemony in the Caribbean.
It effectively made the United States the absolute sole gatekeeper of Cuban foreign policy.
Which leads right into Condition 2, which closes another massive vulnerability.
Economics. How so?
It dictates that the Cuban government shall not assume or contract any public debt that its ordinary revenues cannot cover.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and they had to make reasonable sinking fund provisions for the ultimate discharge of any debt they took on.
Okay, for anyone listening who is unfamiliar with the financial term, what exactly is a sinking fund provision in this historical context?
Good question. It means they had to legally set aside a dedicated portion of their regular government income every single year, specifically to pay off the principal of their debts.
So they couldn't just pay the interest and roll the debt over like most countries do.
No, they couldn't. They were forced onto a highly restrictive financial diet, using only regular tax revenues, after paying all their normal government expenses.
It sounds like forced fiscal responsibility,
Yeah.
but I'm guessing the U.S. didn't include this just because they wanted Cuban accountants to balance their books.
No, the motivation was entirely strategic.
What was the strategy?
Well, during the turn of the 20th century, European powers frequently used a diplomatic tactic known as gunboat diplomacy.
Gunboat diplomacy.
Right. If a smaller developing nation defaulted on its loans to European banks, countries like Britain or Germany would use that default as a legal excuse to send warships, literally seize control of local customs houses, and basically take over the country's finances to extract the debt owed.
Wow, so they would just show up with guns and take the tax money.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So by strictly limiting Cuba's ability to take on debt in the first place, the U.S. was eliminating the primary excuse any European power might use to physically intervene in the Caribbean.
Okay, I see. They closed the diplomatic backdoor with Condition 1, and they closed the economic backdoor with Condition 2,
Right.
which perfectly sets up the front door, Condition 3.
Condition 3 is the true heart of the amendment. It dictates that the government of Cuba consents that the United States may exercise the right to intervene for the preservation of Cuban independence.
Wait, intervene for independence?
Yes, and it says, and the maintenance of a government adequate for the protection of life, property, and individual liberty.
The Machiavellian brilliance of that phrasing is staggering.
It really is.
They forced Cuba to give the U.S. the right to invade in the name of preserving independence.
It's Orwellian. By embedding this clause, the United States legalized perpetual oversight.
Because who defines what adequate means?
Exactly. The standard of what constituted an adequate government was entirely up to Washington.
Right.
So if there was a labor strike threatening American sugar mills or a disputed local election, the U.S. could literally point to Condition the Third and declare they were legally intervening to protect property just as the treaty allowed.
It completely nullifies the entire concept of internal sovereignty.
Completely. The Cuban government would constantly operate under the looming threat that the Marines could be legally dispatched if American interests were threatened.
And what is Condition 3 a demand? We are halfway through.
Condition 4 grants absolute retroactive immunity.
Immunity for who?
The U.S. It demands that all acts of the United States in Cuba during its military occupancy are ratified and validated, and all lawful rights acquired under that occupation shall be maintained and protected.
Oh, wow. So everything the occupying force did, whether that's property transfers, legal rulings, infrastructure decisions, it was all permanently cemented into law.
Yes, and the new Cuban government could never, ever challenge it in a Cuban court.
That is ironclad. Okay, that brings us to Condition V, which is the one that always catches people off guard when they read the actual document.
It does seem out of place.
Because we go from military intervention and sovereign debt straight into public works.
Yes, Condition V mandates that the government of Cuba will execute and, if necessary, extend plans already devised for the sanitation of the cities of the island.
Wait, how does a public health mandate end up in a geopolitical treaty? Why is the U.S. Secretary of War dictating local street sweeping and sewer policies?
Well, the document explicitly states the rationale, actually. It says this sanitation is required to prevent the recurrence of epidemic diseases, assuring protection to commerce, quote, as well as to the commerce of the southern ports of the United States and the people residing therein.
So it's about protecting the U.S. again.
Entirely. The primary fear was yellow fever. Epidemics frequently spread from the Caribbean to vital U.S. port cities like New Orleans.
Right, which would devastate trade.
Exactly. During the occupation, General Wood had used Cuban treasury funds for aggressive sanitation campaigns. The U.S. wanted to ensure the Cuban government was legally obligated to continue footing the bill for these incredibly expensive public health programs.
Just to maintain a sanitary buffer zone for the American South.
Exactly.
So even the local health budget is subordinated to the defense of American trade routes.
That's the reality of it. Now, Condition 6 moves back to geopolitics, dealing with physical territory.
What's the territorial demand?
Condition 6 declares that the Isle of Pines, which is a significant island off the southwestern coast of Cuba, known today as Isla de la Juventud, shall be omitted from the proposed constitutional boundaries of Cuba.
They just erased it from the map.
Essentially, the title to the island was left to, quote, future adjustment by treaty.
They literally carved a piece of land off the map and held it in geopolitical escrow.
That's a great way to put it, escrow.
Because it creates immediate leverage. If Cuba ever wanted that island recognized as their own territory, they would have to offer the U.S. concessions somewhere else down the line.
And that leverage ties directly into Condition 7, which is perhaps the most infamous provision of the whole amendment.
Okay, lay it on us.
It states that to enable the U.S. to maintain the independence of Cuba, the government of Cuba will sell or lease to the United States lands necessary for coaling or naval stations at certain specified points.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because this wasn't a minor request. The original demands from U.S. officials were massive, weren't they?
Oh, absolutely. They initially wanted the right to build 4 separate permanent military bases scattered all across the island.
They essentially wanted control of the entire Cuban waterfront.
They did. But the Cuban representatives pushed back fiercely on this point during negotiations. It is actually one of the very few areas where they managed to secure a compromise.
Really?
Yeah, they negotiated it down, reducing the demand from 4 bases down to 2 locations.
Which were?
Guantanamo Bay on the southeast coast and Bahia Honda on the northwest.
See, Bahia Honda is a fascinating historical footnote to me. We all know the modern legacy of Guantanamo, but there was a second base originally.
Yes, there was, though in 1912, the U.S. and Cuba negotiated a swap.
What kind of swap?
The U.S. relinquished its rights to Bahia Honda in exchange for leasing an expanded footprint of land around Guantanamo Bay.
Consolidating their presence.
Exactly. But the underlying reality of Condition 7 remained. Cuba was formally forced to surrender sovereign territory to a foreign military indefinitely.
Which leaves the final lock on the cage, Condition 8.
Condition 8 simply demands that the government of Cuba embodies all the preceding provisions in a permanent treaty with the United States.
Make it legal forever.
And furthermore, the U.S. insisted that these exact conditions be written directly into the 1901 Cuban Constitution itself.
So the very birth certificate of the nation, the document that is supposed to enshrine their freedom, has to literally include an 8-point list of how a foreign power can control them.
It's staggering.
How did the Cuban Constituent Assembly react to being handed this ultimatum? I can't imagine they were happy.
They reacted with deep division and profound outrage.
I bet.
The sources show the assembly actually initially rejected the amendment. They fiercely debated it, but the reality of the American military presence on the island was just overwhelming.
The troops were right there.
Right, and the U.S. made it abundantly clear the troops would not leave, and Cuban independence would simply not be recognized until the amendment was accepted.
A literal gun to their heads.
So finally, on June 12, 1901, the assembly voted.
Yeah, it was the tally.
It passed by a margin of 16 to 11 with 4 abstentions.
16 people voting to accept a compromise sovereignty just to get the occupying army to leave. 11 refusing to bend, and 4 unwilling to cast a vote either way. That isn't a triumphant birth of a nation. It's a capitulation under duress.
And 2 years later, in 1903, Cuba formally entered into the Treaty of Relations, making those terms binding international law.
Now, a casual reading of those 8 conditions might suggest the U.S. was, primarily concerned with military security and political stability.
Sure, keeping European rivals out of the Caribbean and maintaining a naval presence.
Right. But the political cage was really just the architecture needed to protect something much more lucrative.
Economics?
Exactly. Because once the Platt Amendment was firmly in place, once the threat of European interference was completely gone, and the U.S. had the legal right to send in troops to protect, quote-unquote, property, Wall Street realized their investments in Cuba were essentially backed by the United States military.
It was a green light for investors.
And that realization triggers an absolute tsunami of corporate cash.
The economic stranglehold begins immediately. Following the acceptance of the amendment, the U.S. and Cuba ratified a tariff agreement.
Okay, what did the tariff agreement do?
This gave Cuban sugar preferential access to the massive U.S. consumer market, and in return, American manufactured goods got preferential access to Cuba.
See, a tariff agreement sounds mutually beneficial until you consider the massive disparity in economic power between an industrial giant and a war-torn agricultural island.
Exactly.
When American capital flooded into Cuba, it completely distorted the local economy.
The influx of money was staggering. Historical sources indicate that between 1903 and 1913, American companies poured over $200 million into the Cuban sugar industry.
$200 million in the early 1900s.
It was an astronomical sum. But that capital wasn't used to empower small local farmers. It was used to execute massive corporate consolidation.
What does that consolidation actually look like on the ground? Because it's not just a company buying a factory, right?
No, it is the wholesale acquisition of geography.
Wow.
Enormous American-owned sugar mills used that capital to just buy up vast tracts of land. The estimates in the sources suggest that rapidly 20% of all Cuban land ended up being owned by these massive sugar syndicates.
Imagine that. 1 out of every 5 acres in your entire country owned by foreign corporations focused on a single export crop.
It's hard to even conceptualize.
Right. If you are an independent Cuban farmer growing diverse crops for your community, you are suddenly surrounded by corporate monoculture. And these syndicates didn't just buy the fields.
They bought the infrastructure.
For railroads.
Yes. The major sugar mills built, owned, and operated the railroads. And they didn't run these trains as public utilities to connect Cuban towns.
Of course not.
They ran them as private logistical arteries. The trains existed purely to move sugar from the fields to the mills and from the mills to the shipping ports.
This is a crucial point about how monopolies work, too. Because the American mills own the only trains, an independent Cuban farmer who actually managed to hold on to his land was essentially trapped.
Completely trapped.
He couldn't just ship his sugar to a competing buyer in another province. The local mill dictated the freight rates, and they dictated the purchase price.
He held all the cards.
If the farmer refused to accept their rock-bottom offer, his sugar cane would literally rot on the platform. The train just wouldn't pick it up.
It is a closed loop of economic extraction. The mills control the land, the transport, and the market.
Did the Cuban government try to stop this? Or were their hands tied by the debt and intervention clauses we just talked about?
They were totally paralyzed from intervening.
Because of the Platt Amendment.
Exactly. If the Cuban government attempted to pass antitrust legislation or redistribute land or heavily regulate those railroads, the U.S. could just point to Condition 3rd of the Platt Amendment.
You are protecting property.
Right. They'd declare the government was failing to protect property and deploy the military.
So the local farmers are squeezed out. What happens to the thousands of rural Cubans who now have to work for these massive syndicates?
The sources describe a state of severe impoverishment and deep insecurity for the rural masses. Mill workers lived on corporate-owned land and faced constant threat of eviction if they demanded better conditions.
Yeah, it's brutal.
Furthermore, to deliberately crush any leverage the workers might have had to negotiate higher wages, the syndicates imported cheap labor from other parts of the Caribbean.
Pitting workers against each other.
By flooding the labor market, they kept wages at an absolute subsistence minimum.
If the vast majority of your population is working for poverty wages, they have no disposable income. And that triggers a devastating macroeconomic chain reaction.
Exactly. Because the Cuban working class had virtually zero purchasing power, there was no domestic market for manufactured goods.
Right. If you can't afford a shirt, no one's going to build a shirt factory.
Exactly. If your population can't afford to buy shoes, clothing, or basic tools, there is absolutely no incentive for entrepreneurs to build factories on the island to produce those goods.
It stunts everything.
The structural outcome was that Cuba's industrialization was completely stunted in the decade following the 1903 treaty.
Wow.
While the U.S. economy diversified and modernized rapidly, Cuba was frozen as an agricultural extraction zone.
So all that immense wealth generated by Cuban soil and Cuban labor was simply exported to foreign bank accounts. And, this economic marginalization inevitably leads directly to massive social exclusion. Because when you design an economy that only benefits a tiny elite, you have to design a political system that prevents the majority from changing the rules.
Which brings us to the profound social fallout of the Platt Amendment era.
Just as a quick reminder to you, our listener, whenever we hit politically charged history like this, left-wing, right-wing rebellions, policies, we are strictly reporting what the historical sources say. We aren't endorsing any specific viewpoints, we're taking sides, we're just analyzing the documents.
Right, we are just looking at the facts on the ground. And to grasp the tragic irony of this social fallout, we have to look at who actually fought the war for independence in the first place.
Okay, who was on the front lines?
For decades, the grueling fight against Spanish rule relied heavily on the Afro-Cuban population.
Really?
Yes, nearly 40% of the Cuban fighting force was made up of people of color.
40%, that is massive.
They were the lifeblood of the Revolutionary Army. These men spent years in the jungle fighting a guerrilla war.
And they fought with the explicit expectation that a free Cuba would mean an equal Cuba.
Exactly. They bled for a republic that would dismantle the racial hierarchies of the old Spanish Empire.
But the reality they got was very different.
Very. Because the U.S. military occupation, managed by figures like General Leonard Wood, prioritized conservative stability and the protection of investment over social justice.
Shocking.
Under Wood's administration, the U.S. imposed strict new voting regulations for the upcoming Cuban elections.
What were the rules?
To vote, you had to be an adult male, you had to be literate, and crucially, you had to own property worth $250 or more.
Okay, the practical effect of that $250 property requirement had to be devastating.
It was.
Because a guerrilla fighter who has spent the last 10 years in the mountains fighting the Spanish Empire hasn't exactly been accumulating real estate or saving cash.
No, they were fighting a revolution.
The very act of fighting for their country's freedom is what economically disqualified them from participating in its new democracy.
It's a bitter irony. The requirement functioned as a targeted disenfranchisement.
Absolutely.
The literacy and property qualifications effectively stripped the vast majority of the Afro-Cuban population of their right to vote.
Just wiped out their political voice.
Furthermore, the sources note they were systematically blocked from many civil service jobs and state institutions because those positions now required the exact same educational or property credentials they had just been denied.
So you take combat veterans who know how to organize, you strip away their political voice, and you completely shut them out of the economy.
Tensions had to be boiling over.
Oh, they were. The sources describe rife hostility and even exchanges of gunfire between Afro-Cubans and the stationed U.S. military officials.
Wow.
Facing total marginalization, middle-class black Cubans attempted to channel their frustration through the democratic process. In 1908, they formed the Independent Party of Color, or the PIC.
Okay. Forming a political party to advocate for your rights is exactly what you're supposed to do in a functioning republic.
Right. But the Cuban political establishment, which was terrified of any disruption to the precarious stability demanded by the U.S., viewed the PIC as a profound threat.
Because instability brings the Marines.
Exactly. So the Cuban Congress swiftly banned the PIC and any other political party based on race, basically accusing them of trying to incite a race war.
They close the ballot box, and when the disenfranchised try to organize peacefully, they make the organization illegal.
They leave them with absolutely no peaceful avenues for redress.
The result was the tragic escalation known as the 1912 Negro Rebellion.
What happened?
The PIC called for limited armed protests to demand their political rights, and the Cuban army responded with overwhelming, brutal force.
How bad was it?
The rebellion was crushed, resulting in the massacre of an estimated 3,000 to 6,000 Afro-Cubans.
Thousands of people slaughtered.
Yes.
And how did the United States respond to this massive domestic crisis under the Platt Amendment? Condition third says they have the right to intervene to protect life and liberty. Did they send troops to stop the massacre?
Well, the U.S. did intervene.
Oh, they did?
They deployed 12,292 Marines to Cuba during the uprising.
Okay.
However, the historical sources are very explicit about their mission. The Marines were sent specifically to protect American-owned companies, copper mines, railroads, and trains.
Oh, not the people.
No. They had only one minor skirmish with rebels, resulting in no casualties. Their deployment was entirely about securing corporate infrastructure, not mediating the conflict or protecting the vulnerable population.
That is dark.
And following the massacre, the PIC was completely dissolved.
It is a stark, devastating illustration of what quote-unquote stability actually meant in the context of the Platt Amendment.
It really is.
And it wasn't just Afro-Cubans who were marginalized either. Women, who had been absolutely crucial to the revolution, found themselves completely shut out of the new political order as well.
Right. The sources highlight the deep disappointment of women activists. During the war, women known as mambisas were revered.
Mambi.
Yes, they were warrior mothers who symbolized the profound struggle for independence and social justice. But despite their massive sacrifices, the new government, formulated under U.S. oversight, denied them the right to vote.
And if they tried to publicly advocate for female suffrage or equality?
Any attempts by women to discuss equality were either ignored or aggressively dismissed. The sources note they were often labeled as radical nationalists for simply demanding a voice.
Just for wanting to participate.
Right. Female suffrage in Cuba would not be achieved until 1940. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the entire political system was engineered to be exclusionary, relying on a very narrow elite to manage the country in accordance with American demands.
But the paradox, and this is the crazy part, is that all of this engineering, all of these strict rules and exclusionary voting laws designed to guarantee peace and protect investments.
It backfired.
It ended up creating perpetual political chaos.
Oh, totally. Because the threat of U.S. military intervention hung over every single political dispute, legitimate constitutional rule became virtually impossible.
You can't have a real debate if someone is holding a big stick.
Exactly. A perfect example in the sources is the tenure of Tomás Estrada Palma. He was the first president of Cuba, taking office in 1902.
Right.
Interestingly, he was a figure who had previously favored U.S. annexation, which obviously made him highly agreeable to Washington.
But how was he viewed at home? Because that can't be a popular stance for a newly independent people.
His rule was intensely contested. When he was reelected in 1905, the election was marred by widespread accusations of massive fraud and violence against his liberal opponents.
Typical rigged election stuff.
Right. The opposition eventually launched an armed rebellion against his government.
Okay, so a real crisis.
The situation deteriorated so rapidly that Estrada Palma and his entire executive branch resigned, causing the complete collapse of the Cuban government.
The government falls.
Yeah.
And Condition Third is activated.
Exactly. The United States invoked the Platt Amendment to initiate the second occupation of Cuba.
Which lasted how long?
From 1906 to 1909, U.S. Secretary of War William Howard Taft, who, of course, becomes the future U.S. president, arrived in Havana.
Oh, wow. Taft went down there.
He did. Relying on the legal authority granted by Article 3 of the treaty, Taft essentially declared himself the provisional governor of Cuba.
That is wild.
A move that was ratified by President Theodore Roosevelt via executive order.
Just a few years after the Cuban people supposedly won their independence, an American cabinet member is literally sitting in the governor's chair.
It shows how fragile the whole setup was. This pattern of instability became chronic. The sources point out a really critical legal synergy that undermined Cuban civil liberties.
What was the synergy?
Well, Article 40 of the 1901 Cuban Constitution, combined with Article 3 of the Platt Amendment, created this mechanism where fundamental constitutional rights could be easily and frequently suspended under emergency provisions whenever there was political unrest.
Ah. So if the government faced a protest or a strike, they didn't have to resolve the underlying issues.
No.
They could just declare an emergency, suspend civil rights, and know the American military was legally authorized to back them up.
It directly eroded the individual rights of the Cuban people. As historian Louis A. Perez Jr. argues in the sources, the Platt Amendment resulted in the exact opposite of its stated goal.
Right. It was supposed to bring stability.
Exactly. But by deeply undermining genuine Cuban sovereignty and preventing the development of organic democratic institutions, it practically guaranteed continuous Cuban volatility.
When a nation isn't allowed to make its own mistakes, when they can't forge their own political compromises or hold its leaders accountable without a foreign power stepping in, the pressure cooker just builds.
It has to explode eventually.
And eventually that volatility forced a massive shift in U.S. foreign policy.
Right. By the early 1930s, the political philosophy in Washington was evolving.
The Great Depression era.
Exactly. The heavy-handed, overtly interventionist approach of the early 1900s was generating immense resentment across Latin America, and honestly, it was proving too costly to maintain.
So what changed?
President Franklin D. Roosevelt introduced the Good Neighbor policy.
Oh, good neighbor.
It was a diplomatic pivot aimed at reducing direct military intervention in favor of soft power and economic influence.
As part of that good neighbor policy, the U.S. and Cuba returned to the negotiating table.
Yes. On May 29, 1934, they signed a new Cuban-American Treaty of Relations.
And did that fix things?
Well, the very first article of this 1934 agreement explicitly overrode the 1903 treaty. It formally dropped 3 of the 7 original pledges, effectively repealing the most egregious mechanisms of the Platt Amendment.
Including Condition 3.
Yes, particularly Condition 3, the right to military intervention.
Okay, so that's a huge step. And a few years later, the Cuban people took the final constitutional step to erase the amendment from their own laws.
Right. In 1940, a Cuban constitutional convention convened, featuring delegates like José Manuel Cortina.
Okay.
They drafted an entirely new constitution and officially purged the text of the Platt Amendment from their national charter.
So the legal mechanisms of direct, everyday control were finally dismantled.
They were. But the 1934 treaty didn't erase everything.
Right, because one very specific, very physical legacy of the 1901 negotiations remains entirely intact today.
The lingering ghost of Condition 7, the indefinite lease of the Guantanamo Bay Naval Base.
Still there.
Still there. That carve-out of sovereign territory persists, and it has evolved into a fascinating, highly complex dispute within modern international law.
Break down how the modern Cuban government challenges that lease, because it directly ties back to the coercion we discussed at the very beginning of the deep dive.
It absolutely does. Since the 1959 revolution, the Cuban government has adamantly refused to cash the annual lease checks from the U.S. government.
Wow, really?
Yeah, they argue the lease is fundamentally illegitimate. Their argument relies on modern legal frameworks, specifically Article 52 of the 1969 Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties.
Okay, what does Article 52 dictate?
It explicitly declares that a treaty is void if its conclusion was procured by the threat or use of force.
That seems incredibly applicable here. We established that the U.S. military was occupying the island, and the Cuban Constituent Assembly was flat out told their independence would not be recognized until they signed.
Right.
They voted 16-11 under the direct shadow of a foreign army. By the standards of the Vienna Convention, that is textbook coercion.
It is a very powerful historical and moral argument. However, international law is notoriously complex regarding jurisdiction and timing.
There's a loophole.
There is a counter-argument, and it relies on another section of that exact same convention.
Let's hear it.
Article 4 of the 1969 Vienna Convention states that its provisions shall not be applied retroactively.
So because the treaty was signed in 1903, a law passed in 1969 can't invalidate it.
Precisely. The legal defense argues that at the turn of the 20th century, the threat of force by a major power to secure territorial concessions or favorable treaties was, unfortunately, a standard recognized practice in international relations.
Basically, everyone was doing it back then.
Right. It wasn't codified as illegal then, so a modern court cannot retroactively void the contract now.
It's a paralyzing legal stalemate. One side argues the contract is fundamentally invalid because a gun was held to their heads.
Yep.
The other side argues the contract stands because there were no international laws against holding guns to heads when the ink dried.
It perfectly encapsulates how the echoes of 1901 are still ringing today.
So what does this all mean? If we look at the entire arc of this history, studying the Platt Amendment offers a really profound lesson in the mechanics of modern imperialism.
Absolutely. We saw how the intense mistrust following the Spanish-American War led U.S. officials to demand control.
We examine how those 8 specific legal conditions stripped Cuba of its diplomatic and financial autonomy.
Right. We traced how that political cage allowed American corporate monopolies to buy up 20% of the land and dominate the railroads, stunting local industry.
And we witnessed the tragic human cost, the disenfranchisement of the Afro-Cuban veterans, the massacre of 1912, and the marginalization of women.
You don't need to conquer a country if you can write its constitution.
Man, that's a chilling thought. It forces us to ask deep questions about what sovereignty actually means when the foundational rules of a nation are dictated by an outside power.
It challenges the very definition of national independence.
I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over. Think about the psychological toll on a nation's identity when its birth certificate, as a free people, is forced to include a skeptical neighbor's demands.
It's a heavy burden.
When the X-ray of your independence shows that the bones were deliberately set crooked by a foreign doctor, how long does the phantom pain last?
That's an incredible image.
How does a country ever build deep internal trust or a unified national identity when generations of citizens know that their constitution was co-authored by an occupying army?
It is a legacy that shapes the political consciousness of a nation for over a century.
Thank you for taking this deep dive with us today. Keep questioning the historical documents that shape our world because, as we've learned, the fine print matters immensely. We'll see you next time.